Tuturor bună dimineața, o discuție foarte interesantă astăzi cu un gânditor strategic, fondatorul și chairmanul companiei de analiză strategică Stratford, domnul George Friedman. Good morning, Mr. Friedman.
Good morning.
And welcome to Romania. Welcome back.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you say Romania, when I say Romania?
When I think of Romania, I think of an ally of the United States that's emerging and a land of opportunity that maybe will emerge.
That's very generous of you. But I was thinking of a broader sense of the region that has been shaped in a very interesting way this summer. So where is Romania now? How do you see it from your office in Stratford?
Well, we see the events in Russia and Ukraine, of course. We also see the fragmentation of the European Union. So that as the Russians try to come to terms with the events of what happened in Ukraine, and perhaps become more aggressive, and the Europeans fail to stand behind the Romanians, the Poles, because they can't, because they're so deeply divided by their economy. Romania faces very grim choices by itself. It must have a new relationship. So for Romania, the really important question now is, can it form a relationship with the United States that's effective? Will the United States have the interest in defending Romanian national security, which I think it will? Are the Romanians in a position to enter into an alliance with the United States bilaterally?
We thought we were in a very strong ally. We thought we were in a good position after all the official declarations, all the official statements went into this direction.
And I think the intention is now clear on both sides. Now there's hard work to be done. The United States believes deeply in alliance structures, but it has become very cynical about NATO because NATO is a military alliance without a military. So if NATO is called on to do something, inevitably only the United States and maybe France and Britain are in a position to do so. So for us, it's not an alliance structure anymore that matters. In our relationship with Romania, we are looking for a country that we fully understand has limited resources and everything else, but to the limits of those resources is prepared to commit itself to its own national security. As we like to put it, the national security of Romania is not of greater interest to the United States than it is to Romania. But we've seen every indication on the Romanian side that they are committed to their national security. And now it's a technical question of implementing a bilateral relationship between the United States and Romania.
So we should better prepare for a possible conflict situation, that's what you say?
We don't know what's going to happen.
Of course we don't.
We can assume the best, but really in this part of the world, the best usually doesn't happen.
Mr. Friedman, you wrote about this situation years ago in your book, The Next 100 Years, when no one was seeing the situation in Ukraine.
What I saw was this. The Russian collapse in the 1990s was an artificial and unsustainable event. The Soviet Union would reemerge in some form, not the Soviet Union, but in some sense. I also saw that the European Union doesn't work, that the European Union cannot possibly survive its first crisis that came in 2008. The fragmentation of the European Union has had a profound effect on NATO, because the differences between the German position and the position of Southern Europe, for example, manifests itself in NATO just as much as in the EU. So the old Cold War alliance structure doesn't work. Where will the Russians have their greatest interest? In Ukraine. It was in Ukraine that they crushed the Wehrmacht. It is Ukraine that is the buffer from Europe. The Russians can't give up Ukraine. On the same time, do they have the strength to hold Ukraine? And even if there's only marginal interest from the West in the government in Ukraine, as we saw earlier this year, the Russians are weak. They act strong, but they're ultimately weak. They must battle for the Ukraine very hard. Very little pressure is needed to destabilize them. And so it seemed to me that as Russia tries to reemerge and as Europe fragments, Ukraine will become the battleground and the Americans will be the primary players, not the Europeans.
So Romania is right at the edge of this battleground. We're bordering Ukraine. What should we do? What should we prepare for?
Well, you are in the same position you've always been in, between the European peninsula, Germany, France, and so on, and Russia.
Okay, but we've enjoyed some very good years of economic growth, of political stability,
Yes.
of the region growing, and now everything changed. So how do we prepare for this?
Well, there are two questions that you have to address. What is Romania's relationship to Europe now, realistically? Secondly, what are the possible outcomes in the Ukraine that could threaten Romanian national interests? The Russians are deeply interested in the Ukraine. The United States has a marginal interest in Ukraine. Therefore, there is asymmetry of interest. There are circumstances, and I'm not predicting this, into which we will see the return of Russian forces to the western Ukraine, in which case Romania has a real interest in Moldova and its future, but also must protect itself. Will Russia attack? I don't think so. Do you base your national security on guesses? No. You must prepare for the worst, because in this region the worst usually happens. So you must begin building your military force, not to defeat the Russians, but to at least hold long enough that the Americans can come.
Yeah, we're now we're in a position to need to hold on until we build the military, the technical strength behind the position, the Romanian's position. So we're barely starting to train pilots for the fighter planes that will come at some point. What do we do in the meantime?
Well, in the meantime, first, it is not in the American interest to see Romania reabsorbed by Russia. Therefore, under the circumstances, I would think that the Americans have a very serious interest in making sure that Romania remains independent. And Vice President Biden and Secretary of Defense Hagel both came here to demonstrate the seriousness of that. The second thing you must do, I think, is maintain a relationship between your neighbors on the flank, particularly the Poles and the Turks, who also have similar interests which they express differently, but with whom you have a fundamental interest. And together you form a reasonable cordon sanitaire. Now, will the Russians extend themselves so far? Can they even retake Ukraine? This is a question. But a national security policy is not built on hope. It is built on the expectation that something has to happen. Obviously, you're not going to leap from the position you're in now to a fully capable power down the road. This is where your relationship with the United States and those other countries of Europe who care becomes important. But in terms of developing your economy, which is part of a national security strategy, your relationship with Germany, which is a huge exporting power, 40% of its GDP comes from exports, puts you at a tremendous disadvantage. Your relationship with China, should it invest here, they will bring their own workers.
Meaning that they will not use the workforce here.
They tend to use cheaper Chinese labor. The Russians have money, they have no technology, no expertise, they can't build your economy. In a relationship with the United States, two things happen. One, the United States comes not with just money, but with expertise. And secondly, they don't want to use American labor. It's too expensive. The last thing they want to bring is Americans here. They want to bring Romanians. They want to build under Romanian. It's important to remember what happened in South Korea. South Korea used to be a poor farm country. It is now one of the great industrial powers. Why did South Korea become that? Because it was a strategic ally of the United States. The United States wanted it to become as healthy economically as possible. It transferred technology for defense and other purposes. And so we had a real transformation. Germany emerged because of the U.S. willingness. Japan emerged. So when you look at what it means to be a strategic partner of the United States, you see two things. First is risks. Make no mistake about it, it is not easy to be an American ally. But secondly, tremendous opportunities, because the United States understands that if Romania is not a viable economic entity, it cannot be a strategic partner.
We have failed to catch up with the economic development of the Western Europe, so to say, in the last years. We had slow economic growth, a strong recession. When do you think will these opportunities start to materialize? When will the investment come here? When will the investors begin to see Romania as a country worth investing in?
What Western investors, particularly American investors who have a great deal of money now because of the way the world is working, they want a stable, predictable platform. They will invest under many different circumstances. The only circumstance that frightens them is unpredictability, the rules changing, a permit that's given, taken away, and things of that sort.
Is that happening now in Romania?
Now it isn't. It is changing now, but the reputations are made. The reputation of Romania was that it was very difficult to do business here, that the rules were hard to understand, information was not available, partners sometimes were not the most reliable people to partner. The Americans come here to make money. It's a very simple thing they do. There are a lot of ways to make money, and there's one certain way to lose money: not have the knowledge of the situation and not predictability. Over the past 10 years, American investors have become very wary of Romania. Montana Roja, a mine, which is an example. All the Romanians had to say is, no, we're not going to develop it. And the Western investors would have said, okay, then we won't invest. What else can we invest in? But the rules changed from the Western point of view. And so it became a symbol in the Western investment community, the American investment community, of what can happen in Romania. I think that the government has understood this, and I think that they have understood first that their major asset in the first phase is their energy and mineral capabilities. That they must make partnerships that is good for the Romanian people, that they must bargain hard, but having made the bargain, they must live with it.
You're talking about the government, but shouldn't all the political parties, all the political leaders speak the same language and join for the same project that will last more than one mandate, more than 4 years that the government can stay in power? Well, shouldn't someone talk to everybody?
Well, there has to be a rule of law that if this government makes a contract, the contract stands even if a new government comes in. If every government has the right to tear up a contract, well, imagine if you had made a deal to buy something and the government changes and now it says, well, you can't do it. Well, this threatens the viability of Romania as an independent country. Romania must have foreign investment. It does not have the resources to develop itself. The foreign investment available in Europe now is very limited. The availability of Chinese resources is greater, but will not develop the workforce. Russian money doesn't come with expertise. It comes in other ways. American money is complex. It wants to stay. And this is exactly the point that we have to now face, which is that a deal made by any government is a deal that's in place permanently. So when we talk about the rule of law, this is a fancy word the Americans use. What we mean very simply is a contract is a contract, a deal is a deal, and it doesn't change. Which means don't make bad deals on your part.
We've made some bad deals.
You have. You have made some bad deals, and I understand why you wanted to revise them. It is important now that you have a very professional group, and that, in fact, private companies can make the deals with their own capital, not necessarily depending on the government beyond its approvals and so on and so forth. But this process, I think, is underway. When I speak to government officials, I get the sense that they get it, that they understand what they need. And I can tell you from my contacts within the investment community, everybody's very eager to come to Romania, not just for the energy, not just for the coal and the natural gas, but also for the people. You have a highly literate, capable workforce, some of it very sophisticated, an IT capability that Americans have been using for years. There's money to be made here. So the government's in charge of defending its interests, defending Romania. Businessmen are in charge of making money for themselves. But together, this is the American alignment. This is the American strategy. Many countries don't like it. The investment comes with the military assistance. The two work together. It builds Romania. Now, this will be difficult for Romania.
How long do you think it will take for the American investors to see that things in Romania are predictable and everything goes according to a business plan and start coming here? How long before we see these massive investment coming?
6 months to a year. In other words, American companies now are looking very closely at Romania. We are aware of one company that is interested in energy development. It needs information. I think the ministries are aware of the fact that information in Romania that is top secret, you cannot get investment based on top secret. You have to share the information. That's just the way it is. These changes are, I think, in the works. It is up to Romanians if they want this to change. This is not something the United States can control. But if these simple things, simple rules of how we behave toward each other can change, I think you will be amazed at how shockingly fast American businessmen can move because they want to beat out their competitor, the other American, before they get there. So, yes, I think Romania is on the verge of significant foreign investment if it can change its operating system to control, to manage it.
What about corruption from a strategic point of view, including that investment that you were talking about?
When I come to Romania, I am under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. If I bribe a government official, I will go to jail. And many Americans have gone to jail. So we won't play that game. The problem is that if we come here and we find that we have to bribe,
right,
we're gone.
If you're asked for bribe.
As soon as we are asked for bribe, now we call our lawyers. So that can't happen. Romania is not the most corrupt country in the world. I know Romanians like to think they're the most corrupt country in the world. They're not.
We've seen the charts. Yeah.
You could have all the charts you want. You lived in the Habsburg Empire. You lived in the Ottoman Empire. You lived under the Soviet Union. You've only been free for 25 years. You lived under Ceausescu. I mean, of course, you're corrupt. However, what you have to understand is that the kind of money you can get under those circumstances will not build the economy. So if you are really greedy, and if you really have self-interest, then you will want to accommodate money that will stay and sustain the economy. The United States has corruption. I mean, people go to jail all the time for breaking the law. It is not the occasional corruption that's the challenge. It's the endemic corruption that assumes that in any certain deal money comes. But I've been coming here for many years, and I've noticed a change in the expectation. I think the Romanians are starting to get it. They may not like it, but they're starting to get it.
There's also the situation that the reality of the black market. There's a black market for labor, black market for transaction. So not everything is out on the scripts and on the accounts. How big is this a problem for the American investors to come and make business here?
The American investors will not participate in anything that breaks Romanian law because it's not in their financial interest. There's a black market in the United States. There's a black market everywhere. You know, a market that doesn't want to pay taxes,
right,
and so on. That exists. The Americans will exist in the other economy. And it will help undermine the black market. Because if you want to do business with the Americans, you will come into the white. You have to. If you want to keep your small business, you know, your small auto shop working off of here, it doesn't bother the United States. But the kind of projects the Americans are interested in are big projects. They're not really interested in coming all the way to Romania for something small. They want to come here to participate in everything from telecommunications to mining to high tech to retail. And if they're going to come this far, it's not going to be something you can hide on the side. It'll be right in the middle.
We'll come back to our conversation in a few moments, doamnelor și domnilor. Ne întoarcem în câteva minute. George Friedman, fondator și chairman al companiei de analiză strategică Stratfor, invitatul nostru din această dimineață. Mr. Friedman, you talked about the relationship between Romania and the EU, the Romania and the US. How about Romania and Russia? How do we talk to the Russians?
Well, first you have to understand who they are and what they want. They suffered a catastrophe in 1992. And the 1990s were a period of horror for them. It was absolutely catastrophic. In Russia, back to the Tsars, one institution works. That's the intelligence, the security people. They hold the country together. It was inevitable after this disaster of Yeltsin years that the only institution that worked, the FSB now it's called, would emerge. That it was Putin in charge was an accident. It could have been many people. But these are the people who both tapped into the money of the strange privatization, the oligarchs that were made. And Putin promised two things. The first was that he would take energy money and build a modern economy. And the second, that he would return Russia to being a great power. It's not a global power, but a regional power of respect. Putin failed to turn the money into a viable economy. It's Saudi Arabia. It ships oil out. He also, however, but he did manage to make Russia into a regional power, which is why the events in Ukraine struck so hard. Because in Ukraine, in January 1, the Russians controlled the country. Not absolutely, but Yanukovych was pro-Western, and so on. Events took place. The Russians call it a coup. The Americans call it a popular uprising. Whatever happened, a pro-Western government was put in place. This was a massive intelligence failure for the Russians. They failed to anticipate what was happening in Kiev. They failed to control it. In the end, where they once controlled Ukraine, they now controlled Crimea, which they had before, and a piece of Donbass, which they had to fight for. There was no uprising in the east. I said at the beginning that it was the intelligence apparatus that held Russia together. The intelligence apparatus has failed. The economy, according to the Russians, will decline by 0.5%. I think it'll be more next year, in spite of energy prices, oil prices at $93 a barrel. Putin has reached the limits of what he can do. So undoubtedly there's a crisis in Moscow over the question of what is to be done now. Now, they are weak, but this makes them more dangerous. Putin must act in Ukraine. He cannot let this stand. It cannot allow a country like Ukraine, so important to Russian national security, to move to the West, to join EU, to join NATO, or any of these other things.
So you're saying that we could expect Russia to become more aggressive, at least in behavior?
In the short run, I mean, if you're the weak player, you are going to lose the fight. Your only chance of winning is to appear much stronger than you are. The Russians have two cards to play, three really. First, they have the card to play of waiting for Kiev to destroy itself. Never underestimate the ability of the Ukrainians to do the wrong thing. The second thing they can do is play with energy. We see the energy flow to Europe being manipulated, even now.
Even in Romania?
Even in Romania, although Romania is less vulnerable than other countries, but they're playing that. The third is a crisis on its periphery. In the Caucasus, in the Baltics, in Moldova. The danger of that is bringing in the United States. they're not ready to deal with the United States right now. They would like to pretend that they're ready to deal, but they're not. But it's still a possibility. You don't know what desperate men do, and Putin is a desperate man. So we are looking at a situation in which Russia cannot give up the Ukraine, and it cannot hold it. And this is the moment that you don't know what's going to happen. So this is the moment where in Romania, in facing the Russians with one of the places that they could possibly try to strike, Moldova.
Mm-hmm.
Here the Romanians have to be very subtle, very aware, and decide well before the event what they will do if the Russians do this, if the Russians do that, do the other thing. In 10 years, I think the Russian Federation will fragment. But 10 years is a long time to live. In that time, they can assert power, particularly locally, particularly on countries like Romania. That can be painful.
What do you mean by that? Be more precise, please.
Precisely in Romania's case, although their intelligence service is not what people think, they can certainly create problems in Moldova. The future of Moldova is obviously a matter of interest to Romania, particularly if its future is being shaped by forces from the outside. The question of Moldova is of interest to the United States, not directly, but should it mean an expansion of Russian power? This is important. If the cutoff of oil, of natural gas to the Europeans forces the countries to the north, like Hungary, to shift its policy toward the Russians, you could suddenly find yourself isolated from Poland. You could suddenly find yourself alone because the other European countries are not going to support you, with a potential crisis in Moldova. This is the worst case. This is not what I predicted.
Is this likely to happen this winter?
Russia needs to do something now. It cannot allow the situation in Ukraine to solidify into reality. We are already seeing the cutoffs of natural gas. They're experimenting. They're trying to see who will respond how. They're playing a psychological game. They're very careful about the Baltics. Baltics are part of NATO. They don't want to do that. Moldova is not part of NATO. Romania is part of NATO. They don't want to do these things.
Hungary, that's the interesting destination of my question.
The Hungarians look around at the Europeans, and they have drawn the conclusion that the European Union is a failure. I don't disagree. They think the Americans are far away and have no interest in Hungary. At the moment, this is true. They therefore feel that they must protect themselves against the Russians by accommodating the Russians. I don't think Viktor Orban is in any way, a stooge of the Russians. I don't think he wants to be occupied by the Russians. All of this is nonsense. He is, however, caught, as Romania is to a lesser extent, between a Russian power that suddenly has become unpredictable and the European Union and NATO that is unable to take action. He has his 10 million people to worry about, and he does what he can. But it's a defensive move, not an offensive move.
So it's all about pragmatic choices this winter and the winters to come. Can we talk about the resources that lie in the grounds through Poland, through Ukraine, through Romania? I'm talking about shale gas. As a weapon of war, can we use that term?
It has to be used in that sense. It's the thing we can use to avoid war. So Russia's hold over Europe is basically providing natural gas. Other energy forms have to be found. Russian natural gas cannot easily be replaced. It can't overnight, but it can be mitigated, limited.
Right.
So we have to look at the countries that have these resources. And of these countries, Romania, of these countries, Romania is the richest in these resources. This is why the Americans are interested in developing the Romanian sources. Polish sources, shale gas in other countries. But remember also that we've had a revolution in energy, and the United States has become a major producer of energy. And perhaps the United States will start shipping energy to Europe. But in any case, we fought the Cold War to make certain that Germany, Western Europe, doesn't fall under Soviet control. That's not a danger now. The Soviets will not control it. But it is managing and manipulating it in such a way that countries like Romania are vulnerable. I mean, you speak of NATO. Who will come?
I see.
So it comes down to the United States, which is a country completely invulnerable to the Russians. We have all we need. But developing Romanian, Polish, Italian, other sources of fuel is a strategic issue to break the Russian hold.
We'll just be back in a few minutes, and I want to hold the discussion for 2 more minutes after the break about these resources that Romania has, the shale gas. Ne întoarcem, doamnelor și domnilor. Fondatorul companiei de analiză strategică Stratford, George Friedman, invitatul nostru în această dimineață. Mr. Friedman, before the break, we're talking about the great resource that Romania has, and this shale gas. So we have gas, but we don't see it exploit. Will the exploitation begin?
First, Romania has to make a decision on whether it's going to permit shale gas to be exploited. Taken by itself, it'd be very nice if we didn't need shale gas. Given Romania's strategic position, and the position of Europe, the exploitation of the shale gas has to do with national sovereignty. You look at the map and you consider, what is it that the shale gas does? It limits Russian influence. If you take a look at Russian behavior in Ukraine, and you take a look at their use of their energy resources, you can understand that shale gas, however much it may hurt the environment or not hurt the environment, here I'm not an expert, I can't get into it, it does provide a part of a geopolitical solution. So I would think that Romania, in the position that it is, under the current historical circumstances, would be irresponsible not to look very closely at shale gas development.
When should we take this decision? Because you were talking about the decision.
Yesterday, please. The decision has to be made now, because now the Russians are cutting off the energy and so on. Everything has a risk. The risk of shale gas, it may well be polluting some water and harming the environment. The risk of Russia.
It is an important risk, though. We've seen in the States and also in the Canadian exploitation that has been some serious environmental episodes.
It has been episodes, but we know nothing that we've ever built that didn't have episodes to the environment. The United States and Canada are developing them, that we are absorbing the risk. But we don't have the geopolitical risk that Romania has. Romania has an interest in making sure that the rest of Europe is supplied with as much natural gas as possible so that the Russians can't blackmail them. Otherwise, Romania is going to be isolated. Romania spent a good part of the Cold War isolated. And you know what happens to Romania when it's isolated. So the environmental risk is real. The political risk is even more real. This will happen. There will be environmental detriments. But the danger that Romania returns to the period when it was isolated from everyone, had no one to reach out to, and made its own way, and I speak of Ceausescu, I mean, this is also a danger that has to be taken into account.
Let's now shift our conversation, please, because we don't have that much time, to the Middle East, to the cradle of civilization. That's where the Islamic State is waging a war, a horrible war. It interests us because the war has gone to the border of Turkey. And Turkey is not only a NATO ally, but is also a neighbor over the Black Sea. So, should Romania worry in the short term about the Islamic State?
I think what Romania has to do is accept the fact that the world that the Sykes-Picot Treaty created is gone. What is happening here is what happened in Lebanon. The central government collapsed, and small areas developed their own militias, and they fought with each other, and eventually they reached a kind of steady state that there's a Maronite area, there's a Sunni area, and so on. You now see that happening in Syria, where the president of Syria no longer runs Syria, he runs an area. We now have it in Iraq. the government of Iraq has disappeared. It's not there. There's various tribal areas, various religious areas, and they're fighting with each other and everything else. I think the Islamic State cannot really sustain itself for very long. But what is happening is that south of Turkey, you are returning to the Ottoman fragmentation of the region. Ultimately, the United States has decided it has neither the power nor the interest to try to build a nation in this area. It is Turkey's responsibility. If Turkey doesn't want to do it, then Turkey lives with it. We don't. If Turkey does do it, then the United States will provide air power and everything else. Turkey now is in the middle of a great decision. In this entire area, there are great decisions. And Turkey is in decision two ways. One, facing the Black Sea, facing Ukraine, and facing south. The decisions that it makes will influence Romania because it will influence the dynamic not only in the Islamic world, which touches you, but also which influences events in the Black Sea Basin all the way to Crimea. So I think we should take very seriously what the Turks are doing and not doing.
So they're becoming more and more powerful as their strategic position shapes the relationships with the neighborhood.
Their power is their power. They are becoming more endangered by the situation. So the question is how they use their power. Erdogan and Davutoglu have wanted to avoid, the President and Prime Minister of Turkey have tried to avoid deep entanglements. They're afraid of it, as they should be. But on the other hand, from the Kurdish region through all of Iraq, through Syria, this is the southern frontier of Turkey.
Yes.
And they cannot be indifferent to what they do. And I think what will happen is they will become more and more assertive, pushing the violence back. I don't think they can reinvent Syria or reinvent Iraq, but they can push the violence back.
So again, to my question, I see the context, but is Islamic State threatening in any way directly Romania? Do you see this happening?
I don't see a direct threat from the Islamic State. There has been jihadists. They keep reorganizing themselves in different forms. This is their latest form of Sunni jihadism. There are many Sunnis who oppose them. The Kurds opposed them, the Shiites opposed them, the Iranians opposed them, the Turks opposed them. Under these circumstances, this group has limited viability. What it does is push countries like Iran and Turkey in directions they didn't want to go. The terrorism can strike anywhere,
right.
And Romania is possibly one country, but not necessarily the first one I would think of. But aside from terrorism, which would be there no matter what, the real issue here is that the world that we've lived in since World War II has disappeared in that region. Does it go as far as Saudi Arabia? Does it go as far as Qatar? What happens to the Arabian Peninsula? This is really the reemergence in a different way, but I'll use the name, of the Ottoman Empire. When there was peace in this region, it was the Ottomans that imposed it. The British never really managed to impose it.
Let's go back to Romania for the end of our conversation, please. You began by saying that you've seen Romania changing, and not only by visiting it, but by talking to people that have been here, to the political decision makers, to the business world. How do you see Romania in 10 years from now?
I see Romania in the current trajectory as having a takeoff period like Germany had in the 1950s, like Japan had in the 1960s. Given its natural resources, given the quality of its people, given its strategic relationship with the United States, the most likely outcome is that Turkey will enter a very new phase of its history. Now, there are many things that Romania can do to undermine this, and I never count on the Romanians not coming up with that thing. But the main trend is a transformation of Romania into a European power at the same time that many European powers like Greece are falling. I see Romania and Poland, and Turkey as well, as a belt of prosperity in a region of chaos and economic problems.
George Friedman, thank you very much for this conversation. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Doamnelor și domnilor, mulțumim pentru atenție. Toate bune.